So hopefully you are seeing the question that we did. This is the question that you guys had for like on last Thursday that almost everyone wrote on. It says, evaluate the extent to which competition over resources fostered changes in the American West between 1850 and 1900. So looking at this question, breaking it down, there wasn't, most people identified this as a continuing change over time, although I did have some people that wrote causation questions. Now, if you're in the boat where you're like, I'm really worried about the skill and whether I can identify the skill properly, don't be. Write the best question you can. There is room for students who misinterpret this, and I had a number of people that wrote it like a cause and effect who were still able to get points because of the way that they structure their arguments. As long as it's argumentative, you can get away, there's some leeway with the skill of the question, but the more accurate you are with the identification of the skill, the better off you're going to be. In this case, our target is the American West. So essentially, we're talking about the development of the American West and how competition, geography and competition over resources is shaping it. We want to pay attention to the dates, 1850 to 1900. So it's a year after the California Gold Rush, so we can't use that. But it's also before the Civil War, so we can incorporate that into either contextualization or potentially into our answer itself. And it goes all the way through the Gilded Age, through the closing of the frontier into 1900. So let's talk a little bit about the documents. Now, I'm going to walk you through the documents, and I'm not going to spend time on every one of these documents. I just want to tell you the ones that students kind of struggled on. So almost everyone like nailed document one. I didn't really see anyone that had any kind of like confusion over this. Everyone kind of acknowledged that this was a creation of a national park, and so it was a pretty easy document to use. There's no issues there. Document two also, I think, was very clear. Most students did really, really well with this document. It's a Native American chief who is responding to Congress and is opposed to the reservation system. Now, there's more to know about this story. If you do, that's great. But everyone got the idea that he wants greater rights for Native Americans. And so there was no issues there. Document three is, this is where I think most people identified this as like farmers. Most people identified this as an African-American family. There were a few students that thought that this was a Native American family, and obviously that caused some confusion and led to some misinterpretations of the document. You got to be aware of that. There are others that said they saw the horses in the background and thought this was a ranch. It's not. It says in the description that they're on a homestead, and homesteads are small farms. So this was a group, because it's Nebraska, this is an African-American family that left the South in order to take advantage of the Homestead Act. And we called African-Americans who left the South and went to the West during this time period, they're called exodusters. And they're in a small farm. The house that they have in the background is actually made out of brick. It's made of sod. It's a dirt home. So they're on a 160-acre farm, and it's relatively smaller. And they would have been, not going to say poorer, but not as big. It's definitely not a commercial farm. We don't see any kind of commercial equipment or anything like that. So there's some misinterpretations there, but not a lot. This is the document 4, that students struggled on the most. Students they just couldn't connect the pieces between Mary Lease, the women's Christian temperance movement. She's also talking about like struggling farmers. People couldn't put all the pieces together. So let me kind of walk you through exactly what's happening here. Mary Lease was a strong advocate against alcohol, so she was for temperance. But in addition to temperance, she was also associated with the populist movement. She's out west, and so she represents, obviously, fears of big business, fears of corruption in the Gilded Age, fears of immorality, fears of alcohol, but also she's part of this movement to try to protect the farms of like struggling homesteaders out west. And so if you can identify Mary Lease as being a populist, this particular document becomes so much easier, because then we start to think about, okay, what is the populist party in favor of? Well, they wanted to stand up for small farmers. They opposed big business. They wanted the government to come in and regulate big business. And that's really what she's talking about. She's talking about, she says no more millionaires. It's an anti-business stance. She's talking about how like the government promoted westward expansion with the Homestead Act, and people answered the call. They went out west. But now their homes are being foreclosed on, and she wants the government to do something about it and stand up for the people as opposed to big business. And so if you can group that with the rise of the populist movement, if you can group that with like calls for more government regulation and more government help out west, then this document becomes much easier. But students struggled to kind of make that connection. A lot of it has to do with the fact that people didn't know who Mary Lease was. She's a pretty big figure. She was an AMSCO, but now you know. That is kind of that connection. And like I said, this was by far the most missed document. Another document that sometimes was missed and that I just want to be very clear on is document 5, R.W. McAdams in the Oklahoma Magazine, 1894. And he's talking about Native Americans, and a lot of people are just trying to figure out like what it is that he was talking about. And I had mixed. Some people said that he's in favor of Native Americans. Other people like basically said that he was opposed to it. And the right answer is he is opposed to. He doesn't want Native Americans to expand. He believes that even the land that's given to Native Americans for reservations is too much. So he would like to see Native American lands shrink to make way for farmers. And he's talking about what he says, the citizenship question aside, the following justice of reserving many millions of acres of arable land. He's talking about at the time of assimilation, he wants like these farms. He wants Native Americans to be put on smaller farms, and then extra land given away to homesteaders. So he's in favor of assimilation. He doesn't have a high view of Native Americans, and he wants that land available to Western Americans. Americans in the West. So these are the 5 documents, and obviously most people got these right, but like probably the day of the AP test tomorrow, there might be that 1 or 2 oddball documents that are a little harder. Just do your best to try to group it with the other documents to make sense of it and hopefully create a strong category and a good tie back. So here are the list of the documents. What would be some of the categories that people used? There were lots and lots of different categories that you could have used for this DBQ. So I'm just going to go through some of the ones that I saw. And the key here is to categorize these documents in order to find some sort of link between more than one document. You can have obviously a category that only has one document in it, but if you can like group more documents, the better off you're going to be. So new debates on the environment obviously makes sense for document 1. Increased conflicts with Native Americans. Both 2 and 5 are talking about Native Americans. But if you can find like a category that links multiple documents together, then that gives you a little bit more flexibility to kind of put the documents where you want. So for example, if you identified the theme of people calling for more government intervention over resources out west, like that was a category that you could use to link documents 1, 3, 4, and 5. Because government regulation is not only like connects the creation of national parks, but also connects the establishment of reservations. It also connects the populist party and their calls for more regulation of lands, like support of the Homestead Act, and maybe even like regulation of like big businesses out west. So like that, that could be a big category that would give you a ton of flexibility to create the categories that you want. Because one of the big challenges that you're going to have tomorrow is that you might have that oddball document, and you're like, I don't know where it fits with like the other things. So if you're able to create a category that kind of links multiple things together, that might give you the opportunity to create just a paragraph on its own for that oddball document. Obviously, every one of these things is tied to to a change, which we can see right here. Other changes that I saw, but maybe weren't as common. Some people argued a change in Native American policy from reservations to assimilation. I had some people talk about the increasing commercialization of farming, how we're going from small farmers and homesteaders to big commercial farms, which is what Mary Lease is arguing against. New political movements are forming. So like the rise of the environmental movement, the rise of the populist movement, the rise of the Grange movement. That was all stuff that was mentioned. And then I even had some people talk about like oppression of minorities and even women gaining more rights because women had more rights on the farm because they're working side by side with men, and they're becoming involved in like some of these reform movements like we see with Mary Lease and the temperance movement. Attempts to spread American values. So like the ideas of manifest destiny and converting people to American and Western values was also something that could be a change. Now, so those are tons of changes there. There's also obviously some major continuities. And when we set up this essay, our continuities are going to be our complexity. In fact, actually, I had people approach complexity in two different ways for this essay. Some people tried to argue the most significant change, which was a little harder. And other people said, I tried to argue a continuity and said, well, a lot was changing. We have to acknowledge the fact that there were some things that stayed the same. And so throughout this entire time period, you can make the argument that farmers were struggling, that different minority groups were attempting to find more freedom in the West. And this kind of ties with Jackson's frontier thesis, which a number of people used and was really great. I saw like the opposite was kind of true too, that even though like a lot of people were pursuing greater economic opportunities and more political freedoms in the West, the policies in the West oftentimes still discriminating against minorities, specifically Native Americans, and then we could even pull in outside evidence like the Chinese Exclusion Act if we wanted to. And then, of course, continued destruction of Native American culture. That was the most common continuity that I saw. Now, if you had, as long as all of your arguments made sense, and you did a really good job of having both a continuity and a change, and it was well argued and well supported without any kind of major kind of maybe issues with your interpretations, I was giving out complexity. And I did give out more complexity points for this essay than I have in previous essays because a lot of people did a good job with it. So obviously when we get to our thesis, I'd say very few people missed their thesis. The theses were very good. Most people used the although X, A plus B format. And so it was just making sure that, it's very clear that, farmers continue to struggle. This changed, that changed. So using the words of the skill was super important. And the other thing, like students that missed the thesis, oftentimes they were arguing something that wasn't true. Like a lot of people said that like farmers' lives changed to be better over time, which obviously goes against what the documents are saying and goes directly against what document 4 is saying. Others were just really, really vague. And so the way that they described their categories just didn't make sense. It wasn't clear what exactly the change or the continuity was, or they used really vague language like freedom, equality, and just left it at that. Didn't describe what kind of freedom they're talking about, or they just said greater opportunities. Well, what kind of opportunities? Like being more descriptive with your categories and with your thesis is more going to improve your chances of getting that skill and that point. So here's how we wanted to set up our essay. Obviously, we want to kind of set this up and shoot for this tomorrow as well. I'm going to keep going. So our contextualization. I got a number of different contextualizations. By far, though, if you were using that cheat sheet that I went over with you guys last week, overwhelmingly, a lot of people did either westward expansion or manifest destiny. And for those that did that, obviously, like westward expansion, some people did westward expansion as their A and then manifest destiny as their C. That worked. Some people did manifest destiny as their A, and then they did something like the 54-40 or fight or the Mexican Cession as their citation. That worked too. Some people did improve transportation. So I had a lot of people that did improve transportation or industrialization and then cited the Transcontinental Railroad. These were the most common contextualizations I got, and most of them worked as long as they followed that ACE format. The only ones that tended to not work were ones where the citation didn't match the trend. So I'd have like people talk about westward expansion and then talk about immigration, and it didn't link the two. Or I had some people that just did not connect anything back to the prompt. So they just kind of talked, and here's the Transcontinental Railroad, here's what it was. And there was no final like link. When we're doing our A, our ACE, there was that E, which ties it to the prompt. It didn't exist. And so if you didn't tie it to the prompt, that might be why you didn't get your contextualization point. Okay, tons and tons of outside evidence here. So the outside evidence that I saw used frequently and where oftentimes got people like points for it, was John Muir, Forest Reserve Act, Dawes Severalty Act, Battle of Little Bighorn, Populist Party, Sharecropping, Homestead Act of 1862. I had a number of people do the National Grange Movement. I had some people do the Interstate Commerce Commission or the Interstate Commerce Clause. Like all of those worked. And so like these are the most common pieces of outside evidence that I saw. The only key here was two things when you did your outside evidence. You needed to make sure that it wasn't being used to describe a document, but instead it's almost treated separate from the document as another argument in support of your topic sentence. So students that explained, for example, say like the Dawes Severalty Act, and explain what it is as part of document 5. I would give them the historical situation for that because they're linking it to a document. And so that term is being used to describe a document, which is why they weren't getting the outside evidence point for it. The other thing that I saw students do a lot was they would just, they'd mention a document and they'd explain what it was, and then they'd leave it at that. Like, so that it was implied how it was supposed to fit into your paragraph. No, that doesn't work. You can't just imply that this is part of a larger like part of your argument. So if I'm talking about the like changes in the rise of an environmental movement, I can't just say another example is John Muir. Here's who he was. I have to explain how this demonstrates a change or how this demonstrates a continuity. So when I'm doing my outside evidence, the same kind of concept of ACE that you're applying to your contextualization is also maybe a way of thinking about your outside evidence. Identify the term, John Muir, like explain what he is and who he is, so give an explanation of him, and then make sure you're tying it back to the topic sentence and use the words of the skill. Say, this demonstrates a change because of this, or this demonstrates a continuity because of this. If you're not giving that explanation, you're not going to get that outside piece of evidence. I think that the outside evidence is the easiest points that students during the practice test last week did not go for. They just like got so focused on the documents that they just left out these two easy points. And you cannot miss this opportunity to get those points, especially since you're going to have hopefully period review sheets with these terms on them. And so it's a matter of just picking them out and tying them into your argument. Should be an easy way to boost your score 2 points if that's something you didn't do last week. Okay, moving on. Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis also worked. I also had some people use Helen Hunt Jackson's A Century of Dishonor. Frederick Jackson Turner. I don't call him Frederick Jackson. All right, let's keep going. So here's a sample of what I'm talking about. So when we're doing a outside evidence, remember, you have to have the term, you have to have explain what it is, and then you need to make that tie back and use the words of the skill. John Muir was a preservationist who founded the Sierra Club and pushed for the environment to be protected. This was a change because. It can literally be that simple. I don't know what you're being taught in other classes, but there is no points for, like, I guess, how flowery your language is. And so it can be as direct and clear as possible. That is where our focus is on. Like, just say, this is a change because. And that literally, if you use that phrase over and over again as part of your tie back, that's perfectly fine. No one's going to deduct points for you because you're repeating a phrase, or you're repeating a transition. Clarity is so important. So make sure as you go through these documents and these outside pieces of evidence that you're always tying this stuff back. And it could be really, really simple, like saying, this is a change because, or this is a continuity because, this is a major effect because, this is a similarity because. Okay, and then use transitions. Another similarity is this, or another, this is different from this, or here, this changed to this, and here's how we see it. So using those transitions and using those kinds of phrases is an easy way to guarantee that you're getting those tiebacks when you're linking documents in a paragraph, or when you're linking outside pieces of evidence in a paragraph. Okay. So there's your tie back. I'm going to keep going. I want to just make sure that I have time for questions. So where I was really impressed with all of you guys was our HAP. In the short amount of time that you guys had, one of the things that I was kind of surprised by, I wasn't expecting it, was just how many people were getting the happy points. Overwhelmingly, and this is my recommendation to you, the easiest happy points was by far historical situation. Students that brought in specific terms as historical situation and could link those terms to a document are the ones that most frequently got the HAP points. And you'll find that that's probably where you got your HAP points too. So like, for example, students that link John Muir to document 1 or the Sierra Club, or like those students got that historical situation. I don't give it for a general, like when you're doing historical situation, you don't get it for a general phrase. So it can't be like at the time that the Yellowstone Act was being passed, people were concerned about the environment. It's too broad. But if I say at the time John Muir was actively working to preserve the environment, now I've got my historical situation. And I can explain why John Muir is important to understand in the document and what's happening in the document, and then I tie it back. Same thing with document 3. This was the one where a lot of people got historical situation by simply referencing either sharecropping, discrimination in the South with Reconstruction, or Jim Crow laws. Some people referenced a lot of people referenced the Homestead Act. And so like those specific references are what got people the historical situation for document 3. For document 4, people got like the historical situation by referencing the Grange movement or referencing the Populist Party. Some people talked about like the Interstate Commerce Act or the Grange laws, Granger laws. Like those specifics, and tying that into the document and helping us, like explaining how that helps us understand the document, is what got the people the points. And then Doc 5, the most common historical situation that I got was the Dawes Severalty Act. So if you have like those terms in front of you and you have extra terms, and you notice there's a connection between a term and a document, tomorrow's test, the historical situation is probably the easiest part of HAP to get, and then especially considering it's open note, and I highly recommend that you take advantage of that. Now obviously you can have done other things. Point of view made sense if you knew who the author was. So if you knew that, for example, for document 2, that Chief Joseph was a peaceful Native American chief who had been kicked off his land because of reservations, and it was at odds with the government, then that might help you frame what he's saying. It might, like the same with, for example, document 4. If you know Mary Lease is associated with the Populist Party, then that could be something that you use for point of view. Remember, when you do point of view, you have to explain what is their background, what they believe, and then how that helps us understand what they're saying. Audience, same thing. If you know the audience, that can be also something that's used. I saw a lot of people use audience for document 2 because the audience is there. It's clear. It's Congress. They make our laws. And so how is what Chief Joseph is saying important for the group that make our laws? Or document 4 was something that a lot of people used as audience because they recognize the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. How does a group that is in favor of abstinence and is really concerned about morality, how would that help us understand what Mary Lease is saying? So there's audience. The one that students probably did the worst on is purpose. And the reason I just warn everyone about purpose is that you have to say, don't tell me what, like, give me a description for the document and tell me that that's the purpose, because that doesn't work. The purpose is going to be what the author wants to happen after their speech or after the law or whatever. So the purpose for 1 was easy because it's a law. And so laws have a purpose. They create legal codes that people have to follow. So purpose for 1 was one that worked, but a lot of people did purpose for number 3. Don't ever do a purpose for an image because we don't know why the author took the picture. Okay, we don't know what their motivation was. So be careful. Don't do purpose for images or graphs or things like that. Okay. Okay, and then just remember like the steps for doing a happy. So when you're doing a HAP, it's really 3 steps, and that's how you're going to get your points. I saw a lot of people doing this, but I just want to kind of refresh everyone's memory that you have to identify the HAP. So if it's historical situation, I identify the historical situation. include maybe a specific citation if I'm doing that. I'm going to then explain why it's important to the understanding of the document, which we can see here on this slide with it's in red. I don't just say, here's what was happening at the time. I say, here's what was happening at the time that Mary Elise delivered her speech, and here's why it helps us understand the document. And when I explain the importance, I want to make direct reference to the document. And then after that, I'm going to tie it back. How does the document then help further our argument? This is a change because. This is a continuity because. Okay? So that is the DBQ that you guys wrote on last week in a nutshell. What I would kind of take a look, if you haven't done so, the other practice questions. Just get yourself exposed to as many of these questions as you possibly can.